Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA biology class, and today we are going to be looking at Unit 2, Lesson 14 on genetically modified organisms, GMOs. So I'll be discussing what they are and pros and cons of them briefly, and you do have a discussion on this coming up in your next lesson as well. Before we get started, just as a reminder, on my website, always there will be a notes sheet to go along with this lesson. It's blank. You have to fill it in as you're watching the lesson, as you're reading through your lesson, but it is there to kind of give you an outline of what are the key important ideas that you need to make sure that you are aware of. So that's what this is on my screen. And again, you can access that by going to the biology website. So, GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. The lesson starts by discussing how what GMOs started off as being. So that genetically modified organisms are all over the place. They're all around us. They've been around for thousands of years through a process called selective breeding, which is also called artificial selection. Did I spell that right? Okay, so essentially, this is people selecting organisms with specific traits and then breeding them together. To try to elicit the phenotype that they want or the desired trait in the offspring. So there's some weaknesses to doing this. We've done this for a long time. It was first done in dogs when they were domesticating a wolf and selecting for traits like, docileness and loyalty, and you can imagine certain dogs have very different characteristics, whether they can retrieve stuff or they're herding sheep or whatever their characteristics that they have. Those have been selected for over many, many years. But the weakness is that they used a method called crossbreeding, which we've kind of talked a little bit about. And crossbreeding is basically where they take two organisms with maybe the traits that they want, and they breed them together, but it may or may not work very well. Sometimes it resulted in these hybrids that actually were sterile, so then you couldn't keep doing it over and over again. So the hybrid, sterile, it can't reproduce, so there's no way to get another organism with the same traits unless you, again, crossbreed. So you can't kind of carry that on from generation to generation. And in some situations, the offspring were non-viable. They died. They just didn't have weren't able to survive. The reason why is because this method relied pretty strictly on just the phenotype. And just because two parents look alike doesn't mean they're necessarily genetically similar to each other. So even though it might look, oh, hey, there's a zebra and there's a horse and they're very similar, and let's mate them and see what happens. Just because they look similar to one another doesn't mean that you're going to get a viable, fertile offspring when you mate them. So there was kind of poorly understood genetics and a lot of trial and error that oftentimes led to a lot of dead ends, sometimes literally with a non-viable offspring. Our modern methods of GMOs are better, kind of a result of better understood genes and genetics. Oopsies. So since for quite some time, actually, it seems very, very modern, but it's been around since 1993, which is a while. It's almost 30 years, which makes me feel super old. But since 1993, a method called Crispr has been around, which is actually an acronym. And what CRISPR does is it's a kind of a method of genetics or DNA splicing. They can actually take a segment of DNA that's desired from one organism and they can take it out and they can put it into another organism and splice it in place so that it's one continuous segment of DNA. Reminds me a lot of like old-fashioned kind of movie making, and you can still do this now digitally, but where you can literally cut like the video and put in a segment, you splice in something different, right? And then you just kind of like seal it up and you have one continuous movie from that, which has a segment in there that didn't originate in there. So this is a type of genetic engineering, it's sometimes called. People don't like this necessarily because it seems unnatural. It's very similar, if you will, to selective breeding, but it's more direct. Instead of taking two organisms and just mating them together and kind of seeing what sticks, you're literally just taking little pieces out of one and putting them in another, to kind of, make what you want without all of the trial and error that comes beforehand. So, what are our benefits of genetically modified organisms? And there are benefits. This is oftentimes a very controversial topic. People don't like this. They see it as kind of unnatural and they don't support it. But there are definite benefits. For one benefit is it can increase the nutritional value of the food if you're doing this in food. Literally make what you are producing more um, calorically dense so that you have more calories for the same amount of food. It can be kind of have more energy provided, or you can have larger fruits and vegetables and stuff like that, which is also increasing the nutritional value. It can increase growth, again, larger, but also more yield. And it can increase resistance to pests, which can lower usage of pesticides. So some pretty good benefits here. But of course, where there are benefits, there are also costs. I don't know what the opposite of benefits is. So there are also things that are negative, right? Where there are positive, where there are pros, there's also cons. And there's some legitimate con arguments, and there's also some very not legitimate con arguments with GMOs. So make sure you're really good about understanding your sources here. So one of the cons here is one of the things, for example, that people talk about oftentimes is resistance to herbicides. In the United States, farmers will oftentimes use seed from BT resistant corn and soy products, right? And so basically what this is that the corn and the soybeans that grow from this are resistant to a toxin that is used as an herbicide. It helps to destroy weeds, essentially. Okay. So in cash crops, I'm putting corn and soy because that's like the most kind of predominant ones. Resistance to herbicides is spliced for lack of a better word. So we're actually putting this right into the code for the plants, right? Oh, let's see if I can go under. There we go. So basically, farmers can put weed killer on their fields and it kills the weeds and not corn, soy. Now, the argument for why this would be a benefit is that it increases yield. You're not going to lose a whole bunch of corn and soybeans and stuff to weeds, right? Because the weeds aren't going to overtake the corn, and the soy will overtake. So, but the negative to this is that it actually decreases genetic diversity. So you end up with like a monoculture of all the same kind of corn, all the same kind of soybeans, all this BT corn and BT soybeans. And that's a problem because monocultures are not as stable as polycultures. Monoculture means there's one type. And so if something were to happen, say some sort of disease or blight or something, it would affect all the corn in the entire field exactly the same way, and it might lead to a decimation of the entire crop. If you have a polyculture, if you have multiple different kinds of corn within there, then you have the potential that some would be resistant to it and some would be more affected by it, and it's going to end up being more stable as a crop than a monoculture would be. Okay, so it reduces. Another thing it does is it increases the prevalence, the occurrence of things called superweeds. Okay, can't spell occurrence. I think it's A. Can't be A. Basically, a superweed is like a superbug. I mean, we've talked about superbugs in biology, like antibiotic resistant bacteria. Superweeds are going to be herbicide resistant weeds. So they have to apply herbicide to it, and these weeds become resistant to the herbicide, so they have to keep applying more and more of the herbicide to have the same effect to kill the weeds, and you're just increasing the pesticide usage over and over again. So I'm going to put, which means that the weeds become a lot of which means. All right. So those are kind of two of the negatives of GMOs. They do give us more food, but we're having more kind of a monoculture of plants. They actually help production increase, the greater amounts of foods that you can get and the yield. They have a lot of benefits, but they shouldn't be all of what we use. So there could be some argument to be made that it's not really a case of whether you should or you shouldn't, but how much should you? It's not necessarily all good, all bad. We can't go, hey, let's do all GMOs, or GMOs are, completely can't use them at all. It's got to be kind of somewhere in between. That's my opinion. So then the lesson goes on to talk about how in the United States, almost all corn and soy that is produced in the U.S. is GMO corn and soy. So it's a very highly used thing in the United States. So that's it. It's a pretty short lesson for today. Hopefully that all helped you out a little bit with some of the information covered in this unit. I'll see you in the next video.